Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the LitRPG podcast. This is episode number 237 of the show. I'm Ramon Mejia, here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course, author interviews. And this week I have 4 new reviews for you folks at home. And that's going to include Gamified Book 1, Beastmaster, a fantasy LitRPG story. Also, Gate Wars, Sprint, a LitRPG novella. And then Condition Evolution, a LitRPG GameLit adventure. And The Heavens Boxer, a sci-fi LitRPG Esports Mecha battles story, Overdrive book number 1. So a nice long title there. Before we get into that, we're going to go into LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, actually not a lot happening in the news section this week, so I want to take the opportunity to just thank the audience, thank all the readers who have been helping make The Mechanical Crafter book number 2, a story I wrote, do really well on Amazon. This past weekend it came out, and just over the weekend it hit as low as, or as high as, I guess depends on which direction I'm looking at, 347 on all of Amazon's rankings for ebooks in the paid section. And that's really, really good. So thank you very much for taking the time to read it and to give it a chance and to give the series a chance and to give it so much love, and for giving such amazing reviews that it helps other people see it on Amazon. So thank you very much for just thank you to everybody who's read it and left a review. Just a few of the nice things people have said about it. As Amazon reviews: love repairs shenanigans, also a master crafted sequel, an excellent story with a weird vibe. It is a little weird, I admit it. I thought book 1 was really good, but this one is even better. A fast-paced page turner with interesting characters that you can instantly root for, which is super nice to hear. I take extra time for my characters. I love them. The pacing is tight. Action and levity make the read pleasant for long periods of time, and the world building is slow and organic. So, like I said, that's just a few samples of some of the things people have written in their reviews. So just thank you for taking the time to do those reviews. I know it doesn't seem like it's a lot, but it's the type of support that really does mean something to an author like me, who self-publishes and who doesn't always have the largest ad budget. But because of those little reviews and those scores on Amazon have helped push it up through Amazon, and they show it more for free to people, essentially, for books that have, more reviews, basically. So thank you very much. And again, without you, I couldn't have done so well. So thank you. That's it for the news section, or really just a thank you section. I'll just stuff that is out now for you to enjoy. That includes The Ruined Temple, a LitRPG adventure, Eternal Online book number 2 by T.J. Reynolds, and also Era of Justice, a LitRPG novel. This one is out for you to enjoy as well. The 4th book in the Space Season series, Autumn Infernos, is out for you to enjoy, at least by the time most people are going to be watching this, on the 31st of July. Also out is Solomon's Crucible, a LitRPG Apocalypse Begins, Solomon's Crucible book number 1. And this one's for fans of this series. This is big. Light Online book number 4, The Defender, is out for you to enjoy as a book. Also out is the 5th volume of the Everybody Loves Large Chess series, Teresa. So fans of that series as well will be delighted to hear that it is out for you to enjoy right now. Also, those Legendary Gamer, and a book called Dungeon Evolved, which may or may not have issues. We'll have to find out. And in LitRPG audiobook news, we have Shadow Sun Rebellion, Shadow Sun book number 3. And this one has a little bit of a small note to it. The author, Dave Womartha, says that this is going to be the last audiobook produced in this particular series. There are currently, I think, 4 books in the ebook version of the series, but he's stopping production on after book number 3. Just him and Samba Theater, who are the audiobook producers, have split ways, and because of various issues and communication and production issues, and I only feel comfortable talking about this because the head of Subway Theater, Jeff Hayes, has had a long post about a week ago discussing how he had messed up. He took full responsibility for all the issues, and he was sad that him and Dave were parting ways, and he'd respected Dave's decision not to produce any more audiobooks in this particular series, I should say, because he didn't want to deal with fans who are going to be annoyed or mad or complain about switching narrators, which is very often an issue when a narrator switches mid-series. So there are not going to be any more Shadow Sun books, audiobooks, I should say. There are going to be more ebooks. Authors can continue to write and produce books for maybe some of his other series that have been done really well, like Battleborn, which is another Dave North book that came out recently and did well. But this is the last Shadow Sun audiobook, which is sad. Also out for you to enjoy as an audiobook is going to be Resistance, Discardium book number 4. Also Autumn Infernos, Space Seasons book number 4. So ebook and audiobook coming out at the same time. The audiobook for Life in Exile book number 2, Watcher's Question, is out for you to enjoy as well. Also the 4th book in the Dragonheart series, Sea of Sand, is out. Street Cultivation 2 as an audiobook is out for you. The 2nd book in the Light Online series, called Keeper, is out. Respawn 18 and Up, the 3rd book in the Respawn series. This is I think a Russian translation. So there you go. Also Arcane Kingdom Online, the Siege Arcane Kingdom Online book number 5 is out as an audiobook. And last but definitely not least is the 8th book. That's right, 8 books in the Caverns and Creatures series written by Robert Bevan, which is among the funniest kind of GameLit LitRPG stories that is out there. So I'm like, wow, 8 books already. I can't believe he's already gotten that far into the series. I'm like, oh, that's the funny stuff. Okay, on to stuff. It's coming out in the near future for you guys to enjoy. There's just a list of more stuff that I'm reading off to you, but it's a way to plan your reading schedule. I know sometimes you got to decide when you're going to make that purchase, or your publishing schedule. If you're an author, it's also nice to see, what's coming out when. You might not want to compete with some big titles. On August the 2nd, Corporate Warfare, All Trades, book number 3. Now, this series, you might actually not recognize the cover. The original cover was green, a little homemade, and had like a little stack of gold symbols. But I believe the book got redid all their covers. They got new audiobooks coming out for the series, so you might not recognize it, but it's super popular, more of an economics angle for the LitRPG system. So, but if you're a fan of the series, book 3 in the series is out on August the 2nd. On August the 4th, the new book, new translation book called The Hidden Path, The World of the Undead Force, book number 1 will be out. On August the 4th, Modern Paladin, LitRPG Adventure. August the 5th, Lord of the Dead, The Eternal Journey, book number 2. August the 5th as well is going to be The Dungeon Fairy, 2 choices, The Dungeon Core Escapades, The Hapless Dungeon Fairy, book number 2 by the amazing Jonathan Brooks. On August the 7th, it'll be Douche Mage, a Glitch World original, which is a little comedy-ish there. On August the 8th, it'll be The Bad Guys, book number 4, War of the Posers. And for fans of this particular series as well, this is great news. August the 10th, it'll be Life Reset, book number 5, called Conquest, the actual series. His name is New Era Online, book number 5, but in my head, I'm always calling it the Life Reset series because that's part of all the titles. But it's the 5th book in that series, and it'll be getting out on August the 10th. On August the 11th, it'll be the Heavenly Throne, book number 2, The Way of the Force. August the 18th, Intellectium RPG series, which is again another Russian translation. August 21st, the second Merc in the Olympus Reborn series. August the 20th, The Power of 9, Sci-Fi LitRPG Esports, Mecha Battles, Overdrive, book number 2. We're actually reviewing again the first book in this series this week on the show, but book 2 will be out on August the 20th. August 23rd, The System Multiverse, book number 2. August 25th, War of the Gods, Dungeon of Perdition, book number 4. August 25th, The Dream Stream Reality. August 27th, another new Russian translation story. It'll be Small Unit Tactics, Volume 1. September the 4th, the 5th book in the Discardium series will be out. September the 9th, Dungeon World. On September the 15th, a novel called Stolen Lives. September the 30th, the 4th book in the Gods game series. On October the 1st, Legends Online, book number 7, October the 2nd, it'll be Dungeon Crawler Carl from the amazing Matt Dinneman. On October the 6th, it'll be the third book in the Life in Exile series called Watcher's Fate. On October the 7th, it'll be City of Goblins in the System book number 1, which is again another new Russian translation. The fourth book in the Underdog series will be out on October 26th. And the third book of Eternal Online book number 3, the second book came out this week. The third book will be out on October the 27th, and the title will be The Fallen God. And there we go. All the stuff I know is coming in the near future. On to new releases and reviews. And first up this week is going to be Gamified book number 1, Beastmaster, a fantasy LitRPG, written by Brooke Aspen, produced by Portal Books. It is 507 pages, $4.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. Here is the author's description. Ever wish your real life was more like a video game? Be careful what you wish for. Felix thinks he's losing his mind when he starts getting game-like quest notifications on his phone. But then things get really strange when he realizes he is able to level up in real life. After getting the rare Beastmaster class and bonding himself to a particularly bloodthirsty house cat, Felix finds himself in a race against time to defeat his high school nemesis, who may now be a 7-foot-tall ogre with anger issues, and save the world. When zombies roam the streets and even the squirrels are out for blood, Felix finds out that it's not that easy when your life becomes gamified. So there you go. I actually really enjoyed this story. I wasn't sure what to expect. It was a instantly popular series as soon as it came out. So I knew it was probably not going to be bad. But when I started reading it, I instantly really enjoyed the main character, I'll say. The author does a really good job of creating a likable underdog you want to root for in just like the very first few pages of the story. And I really did like the main character the more it went on. And even though the story didn't go quite where I thought it would be, it was very entertaining. The game mechanics story are going to be familiar with anybody who's read LitRPG before. Main character's class, which is a Beastmaster, hasn't been used much before. But everything else is pretty familiar. Health, mana, XP levels, skills, and abilities. Though the actual abilities used by the various characters, I'll admit, seem a little wand-wavy sometimes, but it's explained in the story why that's the case. But the abilities are often discovered or kind of willed into existence to solve a particular problem, so it's a little bit wand-wavy. But at the same time, the abilities were always well balanced. There was never any one ability on its own that was particularly overpowered. And they always had like a detriment and a very well-defined cost, whether it's stamina or mana or whatever the case was. And each like I said, each ability was really well thought out, in that it could potentially be exploited if it was used intelligently, which of course it was eventually. The story on its own is fairly slice of life. I was surprised that it went in that direction, but again, it's still enjoyable. The main character is kind of this loser main character who discovers an RPG interface that gives him a bonus to dealing with bullies, jocks, and mean girl cheerleaders that plague his existence. And I thought it was an interesting way to mix real life RPG stuff into the story, because instead of it just being him been dealing with these like notifications for the skills increases or stat increases or whatever the case is, or experience points, it almost became. It's not actually an augmented reality overlay. It is a transformation of the real world, but it felt very similar to what you would expect if the system was using augmented reality, and that the real people in the world that he was talking to would suddenly have overlays for gamified systems, and that actually expands as the story goes on. When it shifts to a story situation where this RPG interface, overlay interface, is becoming a serious problem in turning people into these NPCs. And of course, the story then shifts to something a little more plotted out, where the main character and his group have to figure out the source of this and deal with it, and there are obstacles in the way that they have to come, and it's slowly revealed, and it's done well. I don't want to spoil things, but it's an enjoyable kind of pacing of the story. Overall, enjoyable story. Had a good time with it. I liked personally the real life RPG stuff a little bit more than what ends up happening mid-late story. But it was still very entertaining for me. The fights had a variety of monsters and enemies that was good and well placed. The banter between the team members was good, and like I said, there's really nice early character development for the main character that made you just kind of want to root for him right off the bat. So enjoyable all the way through. Gets a score of 7.6 out of 10. That's Gamified, book number 1, Beastmaster, a fantasy LitRPG with a score of 7.6 out of 10. And next up we have Gate Wars Sprint, a LitRPG novella. It is written by A.E. Williams, the second book in the Gate Wars series. This is 56 pages. It's a short story, folks. It is 99 cents. It's available on Kindle Unlimited, and here's the author's description. The Altarians, alien overlords, have conquered Earth and created the gates for races to do battle in a battle royale across the galaxy. Will and Rachel have battled across their once prosperous city of Denver only to find an unforgiving new world. They enter the gates and they were victorious, but at a price. Not ready to pay that price, Will and Rachel must put their lives on the line again and again to earn enough currency to buy their way out of their problem. The only complication is that they have a time limit. They have 68 hours to earn the reward or their chance will be gone forever. Can Rachel will sprint to the finish and earn the reprieve, or will their breakneck pace cause them to get careless and lose out on the prize? So there you go. And honestly, that's a little vague on the problem situation, but it's a short story, so they can't really give it any way. Otherwise, the story is already finished. This is the second novella. I'm not actually sure if it's classified as a novella or a short story, but it's pretty short, 56 pages. But again, it's also only 99 cents. It's the second book in the serial series, and I liked it just about as much as the first one. There were still minor issues with the powers not having like well-defined limits described. And I'm not mean that by I'm not saying there's a cost, but rather that the cost in combat is not always fit, kind of the math that you would expect to happen. Like they're very much like, oh, I'm healing, and then later like, oh, I got tired. And then later in the story, it's like, oh, I've got an upcrease. And so I can do more now, but there's no like real defined understanding of what that actually means in the story. So that is still flowing over from the first book. And that's just a particular decision on how you're describing your game mechanics. The math may very well be there, but it feels a little loose to me in the story. But the other things which were entertaining, but in the series in book 1 have also flowed through in book number 2. Combat is so good. There's a nice variety of opponents, which makes the fights entertaining. But the plot is like, oh, it's a little forced. You're like, oh, they're only going back to these fights to solve a problem that was intentionally created at the end of book 1. I'm like, okay, that's. I guess you have to have a reason to go back and do these kind of battles. But I'm like, that's all it kind of feels that those fights exist for. It's to solve a problem intentionally created in the story to force them to fight and advance. I'm like, okay, I get it, but it's still entertaining enough. I did personally miss seeing more of a real world conflict. That was probably my favorite part of book 1, more of the apocalypse side of the RPG apocalypse kind of gate fighting thing. And that was a little less in here. There is setup for it for book 3. But it's just like something that's kind of missing a little bit. So for me, still an entertaining story. Slightly less enjoyment in book 1, but still gets a good score at 7.3 out of 10. That's Gate Wars Sprint, a LitRPG novella with a score of 7.3 out of 10. If you like short stories, this is entertaining. And next up is Condition Evolution, a LitRPG GameLit adventure by Kevin Sinclair. It is 164 pages, $3.99, and it's available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Having problems coping with life but have nowhere to turn for help? Why not try a crazy new therapy? The early research data shows that getting thrown into a fantasyland full of mythical creatures to fight for your survival will give you a fresh perspective on your existence. That's what Sean, an ex-roofer turned couch potato, did, and it's working a treat. I don't know what that means. His objectives: avoid being eaten, deal with unrequited love, and level up as fast as possible and save the kingdom of Anatolia from an apocalypse. His rewards: becoming a legend in the real world. Okay, that definitely describes some of the opening premise of the story. This story is eventually didn't work for me, but I'm going to describe why. The story kind of has a rush start with an overweight main character who has a food addiction, going into a year-long full immersion MMO to cure him of his issues. I actually like that premise. And it's just because it's not something we've seen before a lot. There have been other stories that deal with virtuality using for therapy or for other kinds of issues. But this was one like, oh, I haven't seen that. I think I've seen it once, maybe before, and all the stories I read. So I was like, oh, this might be interesting in using this for addiction issues. And it's not just related to food addiction, but also like drug addiction, alcohol addiction in the story. The main character is kind of a whiny start, but it gets into the game really quickly. And again, I thought the premise was interesting. However, I was disappointed because that premise is not really explored in the story very much. It's there in the beginning as a reason for the main character to agree to a year-long full immersion virtual reality experience, but the actual description of like the technology, how it's helping him to overcome his addiction or lose weight, or to cure people of drug or alcohol addictions or any of their social behavior therapy issues. None of that is really explored or kind of described. People are just like, oh, they exist in there and they're cured by the end of their term there or whatever they're doing. So that's all it kind of really came out to. So I was a little disappointed in the actual execution of that premise. The story on its own kind of shifts to one of a slice of life story where the main character levels, meets other players, fights monsters, and is handed a particular quest. And that's what the story eventually becomes. There is an early part of the story that I can kind of see maybe the author is trying to actually develop that the virtuality description of like the main character being forced to lose weight because he's literally whipped into shape. But it just, like I said, that part didn't really pan out, unfortunately. On the game mechanics side of things are okay. It's nothing really bad here. You see levels, skills, abilities, power progressions, and for the most part, it's all really familiar. There's plenty of like little notifications and details. I did like particular use of tools as weapons as like an actual class or talent or skill tree set. I thought that was kind of neat. There is, however, like a level of overpowerness in the story that felt a little bit unearned, and part of that is because there's a huge like 6-month time jump in the story early on. And the author uses it as a way to kind of describe how the main character suddenly jumps in levels to solve a particular harm. I'm being vague on purpose because in case you want to read it, I don't want to spoil things. But that power jump, because as a reader you didn't get to see all the effort put into it, it felt a little bit like, oh, you're leveling him to solve this problem, and it happens in the span of like a couple pages. So I'm like, oh, okay, 6 months passes by. And stuff happens. I'm like, okay, like, I guess. Like, it wasn't like too big of an issue. At the same time, I was like, oh, it made some of the fights that came after feel a little bit easy because suddenly he's just so much more powerful. On the story side of things, it felt like this author shifted the plots or like where he was going with the decision, where we were going with the plot several times. Like, it starts off with kind of seem them trying to stick to that original premise of virtual reality use as therapy. But then it shifts mid-story when the main character kind of encounters another player, and then it shifts again toward after that very, very quickly in becoming a slice of life quest kind of system where the main character is helping out these various NPC players, and then eventually kind of getting a particular plot quest line that gives him direction for what he's doing. But you can see the shifting there where it's like, maybe this is more of a, a pantsing kind of story where the author is writing by the seat of their pants. There's not necessarily a fully thought out plot line. There are some issues with the story that kind of drop my enjoyment level and ultimately led me to like not give it a 7 out of 10. The biggest of which happens at the 30% mark when the main character comes across another player who's an addict and has other like issues. That character was so irritating to me that I kind of stopped enjoying the story. And eventually, while that is an impetus for character development for that character, and things eventually get better, I still found that character very irritating, which was kind of the point for the character, in being that character had that particular character growth arc, but still it's just such an irritating character. I'm not enjoying myself reading about their interactions and the way that that character treats our main character at all. I was like, oh, that's sorry. The other issues, there are some early stilted dialogue and some minor technical writing issues, which were issues for some other people. I didn't have too big of a deal with it, but it was an issue for some folks. For me, the thing that kind of pushed it down past a 7 out of 10 into the 6 out of 10 range was that the actual conflicts and story were just too simple. And they were solved not necessarily by the main character's effort or work, but often by wand-wavy spells or committing allies or just kind of lucking into a situation, which left me like a little disappointed with the main character's ability to kind of solve those problems and become like the hero, essentially. Also, the end just had this weird twist. I was like, oh, that came out of nowhere. That doesn't make sense. And I'm like, that absolutely obliterates that premise that I found intriguing for the story. I was like, oh, that's a way to kind of pull in a book too, I guess. But for me, it's like, oh, I was like, okay, I guess that definitely knocks it out of my enjoyment levels. Overall, I could definitely see a promise for the story, and especially in that premise. And the fights weren't bad or anything; they're actually decent. But the other issues just kind of lessen my enjoyment to the level where I couldn't give this a good score. So for me, it gets a score 6 out of 10. Other people might like it, I guess. I wasn't necessarily bored of it, which is not getting a 5 or lower. So for me, a 6 is like, I didn't enjoy this. Other people might. I have issues with it. I listed them, but this wasn't enjoyable for me. But I wasn't bored either. So for me, it scores 6 out of 10. Condition Evolution, a LitRPG GameLit adventure with a score of again 6 out of 10. And next up, we have The Heavens Boxer, Sci-Fi LitRPG Esports Mecha Battles Overdrive, book number 1. It is written by Ryan Tang. It is 303 pages, $2.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. And here's the author's description. Who wouldn't want to pilot giant robots for a living? The Overdrive Corporation has announced another selection, the exclusive trial process for aspiring Fortress Masters. Designing maps for the Mech battling virtual reality RPG is Julian's dream come true. But a brutal defeat against superstar sniper Dynamic has destroyed his confidence. Hoping to find a stronger machine, Julian enters an immensely challenging map that promises ultra-rare mech frames. During the ill-fated mission, he finally learns what it takes to get better. It's not the strength of the machine that matters most, it's the skill of the pilot. Julian rebuilt his gameplay from the ground up, seeking out the strongest opponents and most challenging dungeons. He explores the countless aspects of Overdrive that he's inadvertently ignored, waiting for him as a rematch with a sniper he's never beaten, with a spot in the selection on the line. So there we go. This is, to me, kind of an underrated mech battle GameLit story with an upgradable and customizable mechs. For me, I'm saying this is underrated because as of the time of this actual review, I think the story only has like 8 reviews. It's in I think like the 40 or 50,000s on Amazon rankings. And to me, this is actually a good story. And I think part of the problem of why people aren't seeing it maybe just because it's not really connecting with directly with the audience, and also the early section of the story has a few issues which I'll talk about. But overall, it's actually a rather entertaining story, especially if you like mech games or if you've ever played Battle Mech or Mech Warrior. This is definitely going to give you hints of those kind of mech battling stories, and you can actually tell in the story the author has a real love for those kind of stories and for these kinds of game mechanics. So on to the review portion, which is basically the beginning of the novel sets up a series of goals of entering a tournament and a bit of information about a new kind of mech which is featured on the cover. I was a little surprised about how little that was developed in this book, and I basically realized as the story approaches, like, oh, those are series plot lines. They're not necessarily for this particular story, which was set up as essentially an introduction to this game world, an introduction to the main character and his flaws and his progression towards improving them, and sets up book 2, book 3, whatever the case is, for the series goals of winning the tournament, getting a job, or improving himself. And also is kind of subplot of this thing with this particular new fancy, world building mech. But that really isn't developed for most of the story. It's just set up. That was just kind of that's a slight disappointment that it wasn't developed more, but I understood why it wasn't developed. It's a series goal, not necessarily this particular novel's plotline. Instead, this novel's plotline is more of a slice of life story, and the main character, who's already kind of a semi-veteran of this game world, or playing this mech battle game. He is training a couple people, and in doing so, he's realizing his own shortcomings as a competitive player and training to kind of rectify them. And that's kind of his story arc. There's a lot of other like smaller fights and battles and character progressions that I'm trying to spoil for you. But I really actually enjoyed the shift, because the first scene in the story is really like this exhibition fight. And for me, it didn't really work well. And I think because that's the first thing you read in the story, if you don't get past that, if you don't only read in the sample, you might not really you might really see how good the fights in the story are, how good the game mechanics are, how good the depth of essentially the author's enjoyment of like mech fighting battles and mech fighting games, which is definitely comes after that first kind of fight scene. That first fight scene is a little awkward because it tries to do, I think, too much, instead of just coming out with like a really strong, good fight, which a lot of the other fights in the story are. Instead, it also tries to combine introducing the main character, introducing a potential series antagonist, also describing the game mechanics, an introduction to the game world, the main character's flaws, all within this fight scene, which is supposed to be actively like exciting. And instead, because of those other elements which are introduced at the same time, that first fight feels really bogged down, and its pacing is kind of ruined, unfortunately. And for me, if I had only read that first scene, I was like, oh, this not really for me, because of all those issues. But after that one scene, once the main character starts his training of his friend, which is a much better opportunity to describe slowly and more organically the game mechanics in the world, and there's a ton of details in the story. That's why the game we'll get in a second. It was a much better story for me, and I honestly, I would skip that first scene if you, just because it doesn't really add a lot. There's a couple reference characters in there, but it doesn't, for me, it kind of slowed down my enjoyment of the story for a little bit. So that's just a personal thought though. Like I said, I did like the rest after that a little bit better. And again, the fights after that are much, much better, because the author essentially, separates the theory building, the strategizing for the fights, and the actual fights. Like they're separated, and so the action has a chance to kind of be a highlight a little bit more later in the story. Outside of combat, things are still interesting as well. There's a lot of good dialogue between players about tactics, different play styles, mech build theory, which is one of those things that make mech games kind of fun. Those moments, those scenes between the fights, actually, I think I liked the best. The action is good, but I like that theory building between them, because that's what I personally like about mech battling games. I like that about Mech Warrior and Battle Mechs, is building my own mechs and customizing it and figuring out my particular playstyle. I never like playing at the players, but just playing in the campaign mode was always fun in that kind of progression system. So that comes through a lot more on those in-between moments. There is no, again, RPG system, which is why I say this is actually a GameLit story, not really a LitRPG story, because there is no actual role-playing game mechanic here. The progression in the system is really from, like a lot of mech games, from weapons parts, upgrading your mechs, getting new mechs. There is a classification system for the parts which have the word levels in them, and classifications like S-class or whatever. But they, even within the game system and the story, it's like, oh, there's a wide variety within that class system, so it's not really fully there. I'm like, oh yeah, I can tell, which really does fit within the game mechanics for other like actual or like mech games. Mechs increase in power through good piloting and through purchasing when you're crafting more powerful parts and making mechs within the points limits given. There's plenty of other game stuff in the story, but it leads a little more towards the strategy of player versus environment versus player, build style, play style, player skills in crafting or piloting. You can tell, like I said, in the story that the author really does have a passion for mechs and mech games, and all that stuff is really deep and intense and really quite enjoyable. Overall, it's a good story. Once you get past that initial fight, I personally wish I would have actually had RPG mechanics, because I love LitRPG, but at the same time, I really did like the story as it was. It is faithful to mech style games that I've played on the PC. I was like, oh, I can see influence from here and here, and it's faithful to that kind of stuff. So if you like mech games, I absolutely think you'll enjoy the story. For me, I had a good time with it. I kind of knocked off a little bit just because, again, lack of actual RPG mechanics, and also just like that early fight scene. So for me, it gets a score of 7.4 out of 10, which is still a good score. Like I said, I had a nice time with it. Heaven's Boxer, Sci-Fi, LitRPG, Esports, Mech Battles, Overdrive Book Number 1. Again, it's kind of an underrated a story, and I give it a score of 7.4 out of 10. Okay, that is it, ladies and gentlemen. The show is over. Thank you very much for listening, for watching us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, on our website at litRPGpodcast.com. Of course, we have links in our show notes for other Facebook groups where authors and readers get to hang out, and you'll see me pop in there sometimes giving novel recommendations from like the over 1,000 novels I've read and reviewed that I've listed on the LitRPG Podcast website. And again, if you enjoy the podcast, want to support us in any way, shape, or form, you can find out all the ways to do so at litrpgpodcast.com/support. But until we can hang out again, ladies and gentlemen, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.